This morning, Portland City Hall is issuing a proclamation for a Vanport Day of Remembrance as part of the Vanport Mosaic Festival, and there's a lot to remember. Situated between Portland and Vancouver, Vanport was not only the largest federal housing project during World War II, it was also home to a thriving multiracial community. But 76 years ago, it was destroyed in a catastrophic flood and never rebuilt. So today on CityCast Portland, we're looking at this nearly forgotten chapter of Portland history, and talking with us is LaVeta Gilmore Jones, a co-director of the Vanport Mosaic Festival and a descendant of Vanport. She's sharing how the festival is working to keep all of those memories alive. It's Wednesday, May 29th. I'm Claudia Meza, and this is what Portland's talking about. For those not familiar with this piece of Portland history, could you briefly explain how Vanport even came to exist?
I will be glad to explain that. Well, first of all, I want to give recognition to where Vanport was even located. And it's located on a piece of land that is surrounded by the Columbia River and also by a series of levees and railroad berm. And it's also like 15 feet below river level. That piece of land was not, used much by anyone except for the native peoples who lived in the area, and they took care of the land and water, and the land and water took care of them. Mm-hmm. But after the Land Act of 1850, the Oregon Land Donation Act, that land went out of the indigenous peoples that lived here. And so when World War II broke out, Henry Kaiser, who was a shipbuilder, wanted a faster way to build ships for the war. And that piece of land was decided as a prime location because it was close to the shipbuilding that was taking place in Vancouver and Portland. So hence Vanport. And
I finally got it. Vancouver Portland.
And Portland. Ooh. Exactly. The city of Portland did not want, many thousands of people coming into the city. They didn't have housing for people. They didn't want to make housing for people. And so that area was selected, and the largest public housing project in the United States was constructed in 1942 for the over, 42,000 people that came to Vanport to work in the shipyards during the war effort.
Yeah, your mother, Bea, grew up there. Like, when did you first hear her story of Vanport?
I heard it when I was an adult. My grandfather, grandmother, mom, my aunt, my uncle, they migrated here in 1942-44 as part of that movement to have work that was better paying than it was in the Deep South. And so when they came to Vanport, they lived on Broadacre Street. She remembered that. She said that she really enjoyed playing in the Vanport High School band and marching in the Rose Festival. What she didn't like about Vanport was the segregated housing and the segregated medical facility. And that piece was something that made her decide that she was going to become a nurse and she was going to be in public health nursing.
Yeah.
Vanport was community. It was life. And they were there from 1944 until Vanport was destroyed by a flood in May of 1948.
Yeah, when I hear about Vanport, sometimes it's painted as like this utopia of like there were so many people from so many different, backgrounds and ethnicities, and they all got along. But hearing that it was segregated.
The housing was segregated. Yeah.
But the schools and all that wasn't segregated.
No, the schools and the public places were not segregated. The grocery stores, the nurseries, the schools, it was desegregated. And that was an adjustment for many people. And as I was listening to other people who lived in Vanport, some of the guys said, when we were playing games, boys, we figured it out. And then once we figured it out, everybody got along and played.
Well, what did your mother tell you about life there?
As far as it goes for being a a school-age person, it was typical. You know, get up in the morning, you go to school, you come home from school, you play with your friends. One of the things that she really enjoyed doing was every Sunday after church and after they had Sunday dinner, the kids who were old enough went down to the movie theaters. And that was recreation for them, just playing, being together, being kids.
Yeah, just like anywhere else.
Just
And
like anywhere else. Yeah, that was their home.
wait, so there were movie theaters in Vanport?
Yeah, yeah.
Tell me, like, so there were movie theaters.
There was a movie theater in Vanport. There was at least 4 schools, nurseries, grocery stores. It covered a sizable amount of land. I mean, when you stop and think you've got over 40,000 people living in a place, there had to be more than one school.
Were there parks?
Well, you know, it was on a floodplain.
Yeah.
So
I'm just trying to picture it because I feel like every person you speak to or you get the recollections, you just get this little piece, and this is the first the first that I'm like, oh, it was like a little city.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was actually the second largest city in Oregon at the time. Portland being the largest city, and then Vanport was the second largest city in Oregon in 1942 at its peak population.
Yeah. Well, what was your mother's recollection of the flood and what happened after?
Well, you know, her recollection of the flood is that, you know, they had Sunday dinner. Everyone was down at the movie theater. And then she said this boy ran up to the front yelling, the dike is broke, the dike is broke. It wasn't the dike, but it was the railroad berm had given way. The dike is broke. And she said they tore out of that theater and headed straight for home. When she got home, my grandfather had a car, and they piled in the car. People were headed up the Denver Avenue because that was the only way in and out.
Yeah.
And she said when she looked behind her, she saw a wall of water coming. And I said, well, what happened after that? And, you know, people, when they experience trauma, there's a place where you just go inside to protect yourself from those memories. And she did not talk to us about the flood until after Katrina happened. And that's what triggered that memory for her. Seeing what happened with people when Katrina happened, it just opened that up for her. She recalls that they stayed someplace, probably in a gymnasium, for a few days, and then they ended up in a trailer. I think it was Giles Lake or somewhere, and she said it was really muddy until my grandfather was finally able to find a house to rent in Inner Albina. Yeah,
you know, when I hear some of these stories, there's different versions of like, oh, they were notified, to they were never told, to there were notices that it could possibly happen, but don't worry about it. And I don't know, like, what did your mother remember about that pre-notice?
Well, what she does remember about that is that on the morning of Memorial Day, May 30th in 1948, that there was a little slip of paper put under the doors by the Housing Authority of Portland. And it said that, remember, the dikes are safe at present. You will be warned if necessary. You will have time to leave. Don't get excited. But, you know, this is what I've learned, though, is that the Army Corps of Engineers, they were looking at the levees. No one was looking at the railroad berm because they weren't responsible for that. And that's where the breach happened. And then, of course, when that happened, everything else gave way when you have that much water inundating a city. Yeah.
You know, I know there were a lot of survivors and descendants of survivors who dispute the number of official deaths. And I can't tell if that's conspiracy talk or if it's something people have actually looked into. Like, did your mother ever comment on the death numbers or bring up any other questions? Because I know for sure, you know, when you go to the Elks Club, they're just like 12, 15. No, there were hundreds. And I'm just like, well, what is...
I know. And the thing about that is she didn't comment on that. But when I have talked with people, I recently talked with a man who was a survivor, and he was a kid. And his father, he said his father helped with the cleanup after the flood. And he said, my dad found a whole family huddled in a bathroom that had perished. And so he said, people say that there were, only 15 people he died. He said, but I don't believe that. I don't believe that, because he said when the workers were working, they found people.
Yeah.
And it didn't get reported.
Yeah, I wonder why it
And I'm
didn't get
sad.
reported. Yeah, it's very
It's
sad.
sad,
Yeah.
And we think today, today we have, forensics and DNA, but then it wasn't as commonplace. And I think part of the unknowing too was that this happened on a Memorial Day weekend. So it wasn't a work day. So we don't know who was in town at the time and who was out of town at the
Right.
time. So it was really hard to get a feel for if someone was missing or if they were dead.
Man. All right, well, let's take a quick break here. And when we return, how the Vanport Mosaic Festival is honoring all of this history. Part of the Vanport Mosaic is collecting and amplifying the stories of people like your family. In doing so, has anything surprised you that you've heard?
Well, I don't know if anything has surprised me. I think
Sorry.
what has sat with me though, is that in 2015 and 16, when Laura Laforte started recording the oral stories of people and the stories of Vanport, how many people were longing for a chance to share the story, and how much it meant for people to realize that this part of my life, this part of my story is not being erased anymore. It's not invisible anymore. It's coming out of the shadows and it's coming into the light. And I think that we don't realize the impact of what that makes because of this story coming to light. Like, more kids may know about it in school now that didn't know about it before. And the connections of then and now. I was surprised the other day when I was looking at a report and it was talking about the levees. And I said, the levees? They still have levees in that area? And it's like, yes. And the federal government has changed the guidelines and the standards for those levees. And now, there's some that need to be brought up to a higher standard. And I was thinking, good gracious. That area is still surrounded by levees. And if we don't take and understand what we learned back in 1948, the same thing could happen in the 2020s, the 2030s, 2040s, if those levees gave way. There would be a great loss of life, not only human, but animal and plant life.
Yeah. Speaking of repercussions, you're deeply involved in Portland's community. What do you see in Portland right now where you're like, oh, this is exactly this way because of what happened at Vanport? Like, do you see any of those connections that trace back to the legacy of Vanport?
Well, one of the things about Vanport that stands out to me is housing, right? Portland didn't have enough housing at that time to take in, 40,000 people coming into town. They didn't have enough public housing. And I see a pattern here because I've been involved in Portland with a nonprofit that back in the 90s, I wasn't involved at that time, but the precursor to the group that I'm working with now, they went to the mayor of Portland and said, Portland needs at least 20,000 units of public housing, low-income housing. And it was like, yeah.
When was
And
this?
back in 1997, 1998.
Okay.
It was identified that more public housing was needed and it was disregarded. So now we are in 2024 And that scenario has grown from needing 20,000 units of affordable housing to 40,000 units to 60,000 units. It's that, what is the pattern that has been in place that keeps the government, the decision makers, the funders from investing in housing for people who are at a certain income level?
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah.
And so I asked, what are the systems in place? What's made it so hard for that to happen?
Well, I have a few theories, as I'm sure you do.
Yep.
Well, let's talk about the festival. It's the ninth
Yeah.
annual Vanport Mosaic Festival. It's underway. Like, what do you hope it will do for people? Like, both to those who have a personal connection to this history, and for those who are just hearing about it right now for the first time ever.
Oh my goodness. For me, this festival is such a celebration because first of all, it does provide an opportunity for people to reach across class, reach across racial ethnicity, to talk with one another. Especially to talk with the Vanport survivors. When we have the reunions, oh my goodness, the descendants and the residents have a chance to talk with one another and make a stronger connection and have a greater sense of this is community. Community is important and it counts. And the other thing that I hope people will get out of this festival is that Vanport is not a story about just a flood. It is a story about community, and it's not just a story about the Black and white people who live there. It's also a story about the Japanese and the indigenous peoples that live there. Because after World War II, the Japanese and Japanese Americans who had been incarcerated returned to Portland. Everything that they had been stripped from them and taken and stolen. And there was a sizable community of Japanese and Japanese Americans that lived in Vanport. And so that history, their history is also held in the city of Vanport. There were indigenous families that lived in Vanport. So it holds the history of people from European, Japanese, indigenous, African American. It holds the history of many people, not just one group of people. And this festival gives us a chance to celebrate that and to see it, to hear about the music of Vanport. Like today, on the 29th, there will be a proclamation read at City Hall that proclaims that this is Vanport Day of Remembrance. On the 30th of May, there's going to be Living Memories, Vanport through the voices of its residents. And there will be a screening of short oral history documentaries from the Vanport collection, and also with music that's performed by the Northwest Freedom Singers. That's going to happen.
Nice.
And then the final day of the festival will be on the Saturday, June the 1st. And it's an afternoon for rooting and restoring. That's what we've titled it. And it's from 12 to 4. It's at Delta Park at the Expo Center in Hall A, which was the assembly hall for the Japanese that were incarcerated.
Yeah.
And that's where they had to go. They had to go to the assembly center first. And then from there, they were sent, many of them, to Minidoka. And so there will be a reading of a play that commemorates that. And then there will also be tours and exhibits that people can see and just learn more about the history and the community and the people and even the land of Vanport.
Yeah. Well, LaVeta, thank you so much for taking that time to hang out with us, tell us a bit about this festival, and for sharing the memories of your mother. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it too. And I want to say one thing. I'm sharing the memories of my mom, and I'm sharing the memories of my Aunt Marge, and of my Uncle Junior, and of my grandfather Ural Cannon, and my grandmother Beatrice.
Well, that's all for today here on CityCast Portland. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more from around the city. Until then, see you at Slim's.